Hello everyone, this is Flip Pideaux from Open Model Project and American Civics Exchange. For any new listeners out there who might not be familiar with what we're all about, Open Model Project is a new election forecasting and polling platform built on radical transparency and crowd wisdom. So through our open source, publicly collaborative modeling and polling, we believe that we may be able to help fix some of what's become so badly broken in the world of traditional election forecasting. Now, as a bit of retrospect, we launched our prototype about a week before the Georgia Senate runoffs last month. And while our in-house poll was somewhat off the mark, our overall model's forecast actually came pretty close, all things considered. We had used a custom curated polling average as the basis for much of our modeling and certain non-polling data like the 2020 election data and prices from the prediction market predict it. And then not only made the whole thing available at openmodelproject.org, but we also made all the subjective assumptions, the weights, the voter screens, all of these inputs interactive so that users could actually interact in real time with the model, see how it reacts, and then, of course, weigh in with their suggested improvements, both leading into the election and in the aftermath. For more on that aftermath, you can hear our thorough sort of post-mortem of the Georgia races and how our forecast did in the previous episode from last week. But today we are turning the page on Georgia, looking ahead. We asked you on Twitter this past week, where you can follow us at Open Model Proj, Open Model PROJ, which of the upcoming races, the summer 2021 races, you were most interested in seeing. We listed the Virginia Democratic gubernatorial primary, the New York City Democratic mayoral primary, and the potential recall election of California Governor Gavin Newsom. All of these are interesting. All of them we may wind up doing. But overwhelmingly, you voted for the New York City Democratic primary. So that is where we're headed. And for quick background on that race, as you may know, the current mayor, Bill de Blasio, is term limited out of running for re-election. And the Democratic primary, of course, in New York is effectively the same as the general, despite the fact that we've had some notable Republican mayors in the past. Given the overwhelming partisan advantage that the party enjoys in New York, the Democratic nominee is widely expected to win. In fact, if you look at the predicted market for the winner of the general in the 2021 New York City Mayoral, anyone trading over 1 penny is a Democrat. And I think there's only even one Republican trading at 1 penny, being Curtis Sliwa. Although it's rumored that Andrew Giuliani, Rudy Giuliani's son, who made famous back in Rudy's original swearing in as the kid who sort of stole the spotlight, is now an aide to President Trump or the Trump administration, and he's a rumored potential Republican candidate. But leaving that aside for the moment, leading the pack, if you look at that predicted pricing, is former 2020 presidential candidate who just jumped in, Andrew Yang, trading at 33%, followed by current city comptroller Scott Stringer at 19%, who's roughly tied for second with Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, followed by former Citigroup executive Raymond McGuire, and a whole bunch more. There are actually dozens and dozens of candidates running, so it's going to be a really crowded ballot. And this is going to be an election unlike any in New York's history, as it's the first one to use ranked choice voting, aka an instant runoff election, where if no candidate gets a majority of the vote, voters' second choice or third choice and so on are reallocated until you get a majority winner. So that's going to make this race a whole lot more complicated to analyze, to campaign in, and certainly to forecast and, in fact, to poll. And that's, the rather large bite that we've elected to try and chew here. So it's going to be a really meaty one for trying to think through what is the right methodology here for conducting opinion polling, for forecasting how the election's going to go, because you not only have to try and sort of model what who people are going to vote for, but who are they going to put as their backup, as their second backup, and so on, and then understanding the reallocation process of those votes, try and come to an informed probabilistic estimate of who ultimately wins. And if your head is hurting already, you're not alone. Mine is as well, but thankfully here to help us sort through how this all works is someone with deep relevant expertise, a man named Paul Butler, a fellow New Yorker, and more importantly, creator of the website ranked.vote, which, if you're somewhere you can pull it up, I would advise you strongly to do so you can follow along. It's ranked.vote. This is a website that tracks just exactly these kinds of ranked choice election and analyzes the second and third round, these instant runoff rounds, and how the votes shift from one candidate to another. It's really fascinating, the visualizations that you can see exactly how how these ballots wind up producing the ultimate winner. So he's exactly the man we need here to help us make sense of this. Paul, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
So tell us, first of all, how did you get interested or started in tracking these things? Your site seems to be one of the best resources out there for what's becoming an increasingly common way to conduct these elections that I think not enough people have a good handle on. So how did you get started working on this?
Yeah, I've been tracking sort of alternative voting methods and different initiatives for a while now. Partly that interest was actually sparked by the first ever time I voted was a race that came down to about 17 votes. And I had voted third party, actually fourth party, because in Canada there's a number of parties. So I'd voted fourth party, ended up, not having my vote counted in a race that ended up being amazingly close. And so ever since then, I kind of thought some of these alternative voting methods, ranked choice voting, that sort of thing are, quite nice to have as a voter. And then around 2018, after the first main election that used ranked choice voting, I saw a number of analyses in the media that kind of didn't get the whole picture, or I think one of the big things I kept seeing was people would say that Jared Golden won because of ranked choice voting, and it was kind of like, the implication that that his competitor would have won if it wasn't ranked choice voting, and sort of this muddling of counterfactuals. So I wanted to kind of use my mathematical background to put together some sort of presentation or some sort of reports for these races that kind of explained that a bit better, and eventually got kind of carried away and decided that I should do this for every ranked choice election that I could get the right data for. So I've been doing that for the last couple of years.
And just for the mechanics too, because as far as I'm aware, there are a variety of different ways this can be implemented. So let's start with sort of the most basic example. Say you've got three candidates, and one gets 40%. Let's just say two get 40% and one gets 20%. And I guess basically all the different implementations of this, you would then bounce out the third place candidate and reallocate among anyone who voted for that third place candidate. You'd take their second choice and allocate those votes to the top two vote getters. And then since you only have two, one of them has to be over 50% and that one wins.
Yeah, that's essentially right. So that describes instant runoff voting, which is pretty much synonymous with ranked choice voting in the United States. But in the theory, there are a number of other ways to implement ranked choice vote. They're just not really common in the States.
And in New York, or really anywhere, but in this election in particular, where we have so many candidates, it's not just going to be reallocate the third place to the top two. You may have the top vote getter getting 20, 25% of the vote. So how many survive to the next round, third round, fourth round, fifth round? If you're aware in terms of the way New York is implementing it, first of all, how many ranks are you going to have to or be able to allocate? Can you pick 3, 4?
To do 5.
5, okay.
Yeah. So that's I'd say it's pretty middle of the pack in terms of how many you're allowed to allocate. San Francisco for a long time only let you allocate 3. Now they've increased that to essentially unlimited. I think it's a large number. And other elections have typically had at least as many ranks as named candidates.
And then is it the same number that gets whittled down? So say there are 10 names on the ballot and you're able to pick your top 5, rank your top 5. And if they find no one gets a majority in the first one, they go to a second round. But in other words, how many candidates make it to the second round?
Yeah, so that's there's two ways that different jurisdictions do this that end up being mathematically equivalent. One is that you sort of figure out how many people that are already on the ballot or sort of at that stage are guaranteed not to be able to win. So in other words, if you take the number of votes that they would need to overcome the next person with more votes than them, and then you look at the number of votes currently allocated to people who got less than they did. So if you're imagining like the most advantageous situation for a particular candidate is that everybody below them, everybody ranked lower than them at that stage, their next votes, their voters' next ranked votes will go to them. So that's kind of like the best case scenario for a candidate who's about to be eliminated. So if you look at that number and you can show that that candidate can't be eliminated or can't can't eliminate the next up candidate, then that candidate gets removed. So you could end up eliminating several people on a given stage.
Gotcha. So there's a couple ways to sort of mathematically proceed through it, but you're saying they're basically equivalent in terms of the result you wind up with?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You end up with the same number one winner. You might end up eliminating people in a different order before that, but the final winner will be the same.
Okay. And is there sort of a conventional wisdom, or from your analysis, whether it confirms or differs from that conventional wisdom, in terms of what kinds of candidates this method of voting tends to favor? In other words, does it tend to be incrementally better for establishment folks or centrist folks or high name recognition folks? Or, is there sort of a general impact of this versus straight, winner, a plurality wins model?
There's a lot of debate around that. My own hunch is that it helps more centrist candidates because it's more crowded. I think it helps if you kind of think about things on a spectrum or even on a kind of multidimensional space where you can plot these candidates or somehow put these candidates. If you think of like the candidates who are in the more crowded area of that space who have a lot of people with similar policies or a lot of people on different sides of their policies, but close by. Just from like a very simplistic mathematical model, those are the people who are most likely to kind of be sharing the same voters with other people. So the fact that their voters can then still rank them, or their close opponents of voters can still rank them, could help them. There's a lot of debate over whether that actually happens in practice, though.
So potentially it would be, I guess, less advantageous, say in a really crowded field. 2016 Republican primary comes to mind, where you have one candidate who might not have broad appeal and yet has super strong appeal to a large enough block that they can get that plurality frequently, even if they might be no one else's second, third, or fourth, or fifth choice. Maybe there's less room for a kind of charming, well-known, but fringy, niche-y candidate. If they're not going to get past 50%, then I see what you're saying, that there's some argument that it would be more favorable to centrists because you've got to eventually appeal enough, right, to 50%. 50% or more are going to have to rank you somewhere relatively high on their list.
Yeah, exactly. Eventually you get to a point, if you have two fringe candidates or like not fringe, but two extremist candidates, if you think of it on a left-right spectrum, two extremist candidates whose base hate each other, and then a centrist who they can both agree on enough to rank second, it'll go to that centrist.
Yeah, makes sense. Now, in New York, of course, there's another wrinkle that's somewhat unusual in that New York has fusion voting, right? So candidates can run on multiple party lines and their votes across those lines are all added up. Do you have any sense of how these two interact, the fusion voting with ranked choice voting? In terms of, is it to take more power away from or give more power to the sort of perennial, you have the Conservative Party, the Libertarian Party, Working Families parties that, their candidate's never going to win on one of those lines alone, but they often wield significant power. Independence Party is another one where they'll sometimes list a Democrat or a Republican, can sometimes swing a close race. Does that come into play at all here in New York?
That's interesting. I'm not sure how I'm assuming that the ranking basically is just they're bucketing by candidate themselves. So I'm not sure how much the party line that they're...
Yeah, and actually, now that I think about it, because I believe for this cycle, the ranked choice voting is only for the primary, right? And I think it's not for the general yet. So the fusion voting, which of course only comes into play in the general, I guess wouldn't intersect with the ranked choice, at least not this cycle.
I guess I think that there will be ranked choice in the general.
Oh, there will. Okay.
That's my understanding. But that's right. In the primary, I guess it won't matter as much.
Right. Let's talk about the polling a little bit. I've looked at the polling that's out there thus far, and there hasn't been a ton. In fact, none in 2021 that I've seen so far. But there've been a couple of the Democratic field that both show Yang, not too surprisingly this early in the game with his high name recognition being in the front. But I believe these polls just asked, for their straight first choice preference. To the extent you're aware, in Maine or San Francisco, other jurisdictions that have been doing this for a while, are there pollsters that aim to actually capture the first, second, third choice of the electorate and then put that through some kind of mechanism to sort of simulate the way that the instant runoff would play out?
So generally, yes to the first question, no to the second. So they'll poll people and say, who is your first choice? Who would your second choice be? Who would your third choice be? But then they'll just present it as if those are independent questions. I haven't seen anybody sort of present this as sort of crosstabs question, for the intersection of all these questions, which would really be what you would require to kind of evaluate, especially if this is, it's one thing if this tells you that it's only going to go to one round, which a lot of these ranked choice elections do only go to one round, and they're decided that way. So in a lot of cases, this is probably good enough. But in cases where it gets interesting, where there's multiple rounds, you kind of don't know when you look at those poll results. Okay, if candidate C gets eliminated, then which of the votes that people say that they'll do for round two are actually, candidate C first round voters whose votes will be reallocated on the second round versus voters who picked candidate A or B on the first round whose votes will not be reallocated. So you can't really do the math yourself from these polls. I
wonder if that would be interesting too, because we'll be doing some polling of this race ourselves, and I wonder if it makes sense to try to do that. On your site you have these Sinkey diagrams that show how support from one candidate flows to another one in the subsequent rounds, and I wonder if that might show. So early in the race, maybe you see Yang with a big lead, but if you look under the hood and say, of that Yang support, here's how it's flowing into the next round. Here's the Yang supporters' second and third choices are Stringer versus McGuire, whatever it might be. That might yield some additional informational value to it. I'm not sure if the sample size that you could realistically do in a poll within a city would be large enough to make that meaningful, but that might be something to look at.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting for sure. I think that's what I've kind of wanted pollsters to do with this, just to, even see if it works, see if the sample sizes can be big enough. And, even if they're not, you could almost imagine doing some sort of Monte Carlo simulations or that kind of thing. Like you could actually do some predictive modeling on top of the polls to kind of see probabilistically what the flow might look like.
Looking back on your website's historical results, I'm curious, and you have some here that, as you mentioned, you have one round or two rounds, but some that do go up to 3, 4. I think I see some upwards of even 6 rounds here. And some are municipal, some are statewide. But how often, if you know offhand, have you found that this method would actually alter the result? You're saying there's some sort of media speculation of, so-and-so only won because of the ranked choice voting. But how often have you found that it actually yielded a different result than if you just went with the first round plurality winner?
So I think if you just look at the first round of these ranked vote elections, I would say I think almost all the time the plurality winner on round one tends to be the winner at the end. I think trying to think offhand if there's been many that I can think of, but I did go through once and I was surprised at how little that is the case. That's something that sort of opponents of ranked choice voting often bring up too and say look, it doesn't affect things that much. And I think that also goes back to the issue of being too confident in the counterfactual. So an election comes to mind of Maine's 2018 primaries, or actually I think it was the general, where there was a candidate who. So this is actually one of the interesting ones where the first choice or first round winner was not the final winner. So the Republican had more votes on the first round. The Democrat had the second most, and then there were two third-party candidates or independent candidates. And so there was a lawsuit actually in Maine where the Republican sued and sort of was challenging the ranked choice voting and saying that he should have won because he was first on the first round and plurality voting makes more sense. So, and it was this kind of counterfactual fallacy where had this not been a ranked choice vote election to begin with, one of the voters or one of the candidates that split the vote had said on the record she would not have run if it hadn't been because she was worried about splitting the vote. So I think, it's hard to say how voters would have acted differently had these elections not been ranked vote, or how candidates would have acted differently and even campaigned differently had it not been ranked vote. Mm-hmm. So I think it's true that in many cases, you don't really need to look beyond the first one, but I would say that ranked choice is still a factor in those elections.
Right. Yeah, and I guess if you're seeing sort of like that Maine, it looks from your site like it was the 2nd congressional district in the general. If you have something like that where you've got the two major parties are roughly neck and neck, but you have a decently sized, voter block for one or two third-party candidates. Again, this is a primary, but say it came down toward the end and you had, say, Yang and Stringer both with, 40%, 45% support, but a couple of the second-tier candidates having several percent, then that might be the kind of election that gets on right on the edge where the ranked choice could come into play. But obviously, it does seem to be a pretty specific kind of shape of the voter support that has to be in play for this to make a difference. Given that, do you have an opinion on whether this is a good reform in terms of general participation, democratic representation? I mean, for primaries or for generals, is this a better way, or is this just a more convoluted way to measure support?
I think it's a better way, especially in the case of New York, where you had, I think Bill de Blasio in his first term won with about 40% in the primary. So you have these cases where like people are getting elected without a majority, and he was reelected with a majority. But you kind of have these situations where, there's so much vote splitting that maybe enough would have gone to Bill de Blasio to push him over the edge, or maybe it would have gone to somebody else. Then there was recently the public defender election where Jumaane Williams won with 33% of the vote. There were 19 declared candidates and 11 were Democrats. So where you have such an kind of engaged candidate pool, I think that you do need something like ranked choice voting to sort them out. That said, I really think that there's concerns with like non-English speaking populations and otherwise disadvantaged populations not kind of having the voter education provided to them that they need to take advantage of that. So I think this is something that a lot of people are studying, and I think it still remains to be seen whether this system does disadvantage any particular groups systematically. I think there's equally an argument that it helps disadvantaged groups because they can kind of get enough people on their side. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think there's been races that have gone both ways. But
so one other question about what your data has turned up in previous elections. I'm curious as to how complete the ballots tend to be, especially if you have more than, say, 3. If in New York we're going to have 5 choices, because there might also be an incentive to just kind of bullet vote too if you don't want your second place support going to anyone, for people to just pick their first place candidate, or just from being relatively, they may have their favorite candidate, but they didn't do enough research to rank more than one or say at most 2, 3. Is there data out there that shows, to what extent voters tend to make it all the way down the ranking table? And if so, is that something too that we should be thinking about if we're trying to actually capture this in a poll? In other words, if we're not forcing, but suggesting that someone actually give us their second, third, fourth, fifth choice in a poll survey, might we be capturing down ballot preferences that aren't going to be expressed at the ballot box. In other words, I guess the question is, do lots of voters come and just give their first choice anyway, even on a ranked choice ballot?
Yeah, that definitely does happen. I looked into this specifically in Maine, so I looked at 3 elections. I did this analysis a couple of years ago, so there were less data at the time, but there were kind of 3 main elections that I focused in on. What I found was that typically the voters who do just vote for one candidate, maybe 2 candidates on the ballot when there's a number of choices, usually one of those candidates that they vote for ends up being one of the final round candidates, which kind of makes a lot of sense, I think. Like if you're a really informed voter following this race and you rank down to 7 people, you're probably more likely to be, starting with some of these less popular candidates, and you want to express that you like them. You probably know that they won't win, so you keep going down the ballot and ranking other candidates. Whereas if you're a less informed voter and you just sort of know which candidate came to your door and you liked them and had a good conversation, and so you want to rank them number 1, it just happens, correlation-wise, that tends to be the candidate who has this wide enough name recognition to kind of get those votes, tend to be the candidates who end up in the final round anyway, so those ballots don't get exhausted.
Yeah, makes sense. And can you tell us a little bit about the ballot exhaustion? Because in my sort of early research into this, and in your diagrams too, I see there's sort of this little gray pool of ballots that get exhausted. And I've seen that there are, at least mathematically, it's possible for a winner to, upon the final round, still not even have 50% if enough ballots get exhausted along the way. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's right. So a lot of people will vote, and they'll just vote for one person, say. So if that person's eliminated in the first round, then their ballot is considered exhausted, meaning that their vote, they don't have an option, that they didn't pick a second vote, so that the ballot doesn't make it into the final round of tabulation.
So kind of like if at a caucus, right, in the big gymnasium, if your group doesn't have the critical mass to move on, if you just walked out of the gym and rather than joining one of the big groups, basically your ballot's not counted anymore.
Exactly.
Okay. So I can see then you could wind up with less than 50% of the people that were all in the gym at the beginning, but still you'd have a majority of those that were not exhausted winding up in some candidates' hand by the end of the final round.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people say that instant runoff voting is it picks a majority winner, which I think is a little bit inaccurate because of that. You can have cases where there's ballots exhausted, and also the definition of majority winner becomes a little bit nebulous when you try to pin it down.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you have a prediction? It's very early, but we'll quickly be coming up upon this primaries actually this summer. I think it's in June. So we've got about 5 months. I guess you still got candidates, many that may, or kind of rumored, may not have jumped in formally yet. Of course, Andrew Yang just did last week. But do you have any early predictions on, where you'd have to put your money down on one of these primary candidates, who it's going to be?
I'm so far sitting out of this on Predict It. I did pretty well in the primaries in general, betting against Yang, and it was kind of joke that it was my own form of universal basic income. But it got to when it comes to the municipal, I kind of am afraid to bet against him at this point. He's got so much name recognition, and just kind of timing wise, it does feel like he's on the right side on some issues around transit, and even his UBI kind of plays in interestingly with the economic recovery post-COVID that we will need as a city. So, so far there's definitely some interesting candidates. I'm not sure yet.
Yeah,
I don't have many money down yet.
No, nor I. I think that's about the right read too. He's obviously formidable. I think he deserves to be out there in front. A lot of these are sort of lesser known, at least to the broader universe of traders, but even to a lot of New York City voters. Obviously, most folks are going to know the name Andrew Yang, and he's put together seems to be a pretty good roster of supporters, endorsers, and and high-level staffers, including former Bloomberg campaign staffers of note. So he seems to be heading off in the right direction. But yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this, first ever rollout of the ranked choice works to, his advantage or against. I think it really, based on what you've enlightened us with today, would come down to whether you do have one other of these kind of second tier or lower first tier candidates, those in the teens, really emerge as kind of the anti-Yang, and then you get maybe one or two vying for third place that hold a big enough block, right? That if they're seen as broadly appealing to either the Yang or the anti-Yang, that could swing it. So it's a few months yet until that'll really take shape, but hopefully, as we get more folks picking apart this data and get a little bit of polling data out there, people start paying more attention, we'll start to get a little bit better sense of how this is gonna play out. But you must be excited for your own research purposes to have this new jurisdiction cropping up.
Yeah, definitely, and one where I live for sure. And I think it's just on kind of fundamentals. It's an interesting ranked choice race. Like, I'm excited for this one. A lot of these races, sort of in advance how they're going to play out, or that they're going to be down to a couple people. Whereas this, because Bill de Blasio was term limited out, there's no incumbent. There's sort of a really right now no obvious front runners. Obviously some front runners, but no like shoe-ins in the field. And I'm also interested in just seeing how these candidates campaign around ranked choice vote. That was something that was sort of interesting with how things played out in Maine, where you had some candidates, telling their voters, go vote for me and vote, or, pick me second if you can't pick me first. And other candidates who kind of poisoned their voters off of ranked choice voting. Here in New York, Yang was pretty pro ranked choice voting initially. Eric Adams has kind of pivoted a bit on that. He was pro. Now he's a little bit more skeptical of it. And I'm not sure about some of the other candidates, but kind of seeing their playbook with regards to ranked choice voting is going to be interesting.
And then on the other side, again, this race is really mostly about the Democratic primary, but is there any, rumored or potential Republican candidate that you would give a shot to, or did you jump in?
At this point, I don't know. As you said earlier, I think, I think especially in this political climate in New York City, it would be hard to imagine, like Andrew Giuliani or someone really taking off. I mean, for sure that's partly, reflects my bubble, but I think my bubble's not that small, right, to have all these Andrew Giuliani fans out there.
Right. No, I think that's probably right. Well, it's a fascinating race. It's always an interesting one. The New York City Mayoral race, always a well-contested, well-funded one. But this one, even without the ranked choice element, was going to be interesting. Coming off of such a heated political season, 7 months after the 2020 presidential, we'll have this primary. Also coming off of very controversial, very non-centrist mayor in Bill de Blasio. It'll be interesting to see whether his would-be successor tries to claim that mantle to some degree, or to totally eschew it and run against de Blasio's record. But then, of course, again, throw in this ranked choice element that New York City's never seen before. And this is really going to be a fascinating one to watch. It's going to be a bear, as I said at the top, to try and actually model this, how it plays out, try and poll it, try and forecast it. And I don't envy the campaigns either, trying to work their various messaging in terms of how they play this new approach. But it's going to be a lot of fun. It's going to be really interesting to do. As I said, we're going to try and get going on some polling shortly. And Paul, really appreciate your insight on that. I'm sure we're going to be calling on you again if you're willing to share some more of your insights. But it's been really fascinating getting this primer from you, getting to learn a little bit more about how this all works and what to expect. So thanks so much for joining us. Hope you can come back and join us again. But in the meantime, again, folks, his website is ranked.vote. And can you tell people how to follow you on Twitter as well?
Yeah, so I'm at PaulGB on Twitter. G as in Gordon, B as in Butler.
Excellent. Well, follow Paul there. You can follow us, as I said, at Open Model Proj, P-R-O-J. Our website is openmodelproject.org. And that, in fact, will link you either to the Twitter account to our poll explorer, the Georgia results. You can actually join our Discord server to actually join in the conversation and help us build out this methodology and work towards the rollout of this next iteration of the forecast. So come join us there, join the conversation. Thank you for joining us today. Paul, pleasure to chat with you.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure as well.
We'll talk to you all again soon.